Hey, good news. I'm coaching again. There's a link at wisesquirrels.com/coaching. Head over to the website, click that link, sign up for a free call with me today. Welcome to Wise Squirrels, the podcast for late diagnosed adults with ADHD. I'm your host, Dave Delaney. In Julia Cameron's essential book for creatives, The Artist's Way, she introduces a concept called the artist's date. So this is like a key tool for nurturing creativity. The book's excellent. I've always really loved it. There's lots of different exercises in it to re-spark your creativity. Personally, I've been in a bit of a rut lately, especially working alone from home where my office is located. With little travel and limited socializing, I've been feeling a little lonely and a little stuck. And when I go for local hikes and parks, I shoot for around 5 miles to clear my head, maybe problem solve, burn some calories while I'm at it, and of course, enjoy that fresh air. I love hiking. I love getting outside and pushing myself that way. And of course, with ADHD, exercise is even more important to help us clear the cobwebs and take care of ourselves. So feeling in a little bit of a rut lately, I'd been kicking around the idea of a hike, but I decided instead to surround myself with people again. I enjoy being around people. I'm a bit of an extrovert, I must say. So I did something for the first time ever. I took a mental health day off, something, as I mentioned, that Cameron calls the artist's date. So I wanted to share her key principles of an artist's date, what this is, and maybe inspire you to do something similar. So there's 4 points here that I wanted to share. The first is that it should be a solo activity. So the artist's date is meant to be done alone. This is important because it allows you to reconnect with your inner artist without distractions or the influence of others. And I often want to put it out there on social media, like, hey, come join me. And I was tempted to do that before I embarked on this day off to explore Nashville and decided against it because, I was kind of following this idea of the artist's date. Cameron's second key principle here is to make it fun and playful. The activity should be something that feels like fun rather than work. It's about indulging your curiosity and sense of wonder, whether that's through visiting a museum or browsing a bookstore, watching a movie in a theater, or even engaging in a playful hands-on activity like painting or crafting. Her third principle is make it inspiring. So the purpose of the artist's date is to inspire you. It's about filling that creative well with new experiences, sights, sounds, and sensations that can then later fuel your artistic work. And then finally, non-productivity focus. So the artist's date is not about producing something or achieving any goal. It's purely about the experience and the enjoyment of the activity, which can indirectly stimulate creative ideas and energy. So rather than spending time as I do each day dwelling on my business development ideas or stewing in self-doubt, which has a tendency to hit entrepreneurs like a ton of bricks and is especially a bit of a kick in the pants for my fellow wise squirrels listening, I loosely planned my 6-mile route around downtown Nashville just to go and explore again. So I kicked off the day by driving down to the Gulch, which is a pretty affluent area of Nashville, where I parked my car and I went to a fancy coffee shop and a fancy hotel and enjoyed a fancy coffee. And it was nice just to sit there, write in my journal, read my book, and drink some coffee. After this, I decided to wander over to a place called Cummins Station, which is an old warehouse that has been restored. It's not one of those new warehouses being restored. Cummins Station has been office space since I moved to Nashville 16 years ago, and there's some retail space in there as well. So my son had been talking about trying sushi, and there used to be a great sushi restaurant there. So I thought, well, I should walk over there and see if it's still there. And sure enough, it was. Wild Wasabi. Great place if you're in Nashville. I'm thrilled to see it's still there. And then I walked through the building and noticed where a bookstore used to be that I thought had closed, but had hoped somehow that it maybe was still there, but it was not. After that, I walked over to Union Station, which is a former train station and now just an absolutely gorgeous hotel and very historic in Nashville as well. And so I sat in the lobby pretending I was waiting for somebody. It was the morning, so I helped myself to some coffee and just started writing in my journal again. I was reminded of the time that I was in Union Station Hotel, right in the lobby, and Billy Bragg and Joe Henry were there. And I'd met Billy a year before, and so we were kind of hanging out a little, but they were there to perform music from an album they had cut, which was all sort of Americana train music. It was really cool. Anyway, they weren't there this time, but I did recall that memory. And also, I also remembered delivering some presentations and training at some events and conferences in the hotel as well. In fact, that event space is now a restaurant, and pretty nice one at that. So after hanging around there and having a couple cups of coffee, now already, drinking too much coffee at this point, I went over to the Frist Museum. And the Frist Museum is this gorgeous art museum. It's not huge, but it's a great size for Nashville. And it's always been a place that I love, but I don't get to enough. I used to take my kids there a lot when they were little because there's a great room upstairs for kids to get their hands dirty and play with whatever exhibits are there for them to explore. What was interesting is going to the Frist Museum, I didn't know what the exhibits were, nor did I really care. I just went to, not think about work and explore. And so the two exhibits that were there, one was called Lee Alexander McQueen and Anne Ray Rendezvous, which was an exhibit of their famous dresses, fashion, clearly not in my world. In fact, I don't even know. I suppose Anne Ray was the designer and Lee Alexander McQueen was the photographer. I hope I didn't butcher that. But it was a cool exhibit because it was these gorgeous dresses, but it was also the photography of sort of the behind the scenes of those shows. So it's an interesting mix and interesting story that I won't dwell on here. Upstairs, there was the Printing the Revolution, the rise and impact of Chicano graphics, 1965 to now. So it was very much a lot of protest art from mainly Mexican Americans and super cool. I think the mix of these two different, very different types of art. A lot of this was print, some photography as well. Very creative. And it did get me thinking about some ideas I've had in the past about printmaking and photography that I may just tap into further. So after visiting the gallery, I walked up to Hillsborough Village and I went over to an old coffee shop called Fido, which has been there for as long as I've been in Nashville and much longer. And always a favorite, but I hadn't been to in years, or maybe at least a year. And just sat there, had some food, and looked out of the window at the street, which had changed a lot in the years that I've been in Nashville. But it was nice just to sit and relax and journal and read. And I was a sweaty mess when I got there, I have to say. I'm glad I didn't run into anyone I knew. I thought I might, but I was sopping wet because it was a fair walk, a couple miles. And it is August in Nashville after all. So I walked back down to the Gulch and I did pop my head in a few shops and things along the way, got my car and drove home just in time to pick up my wife from work. And I have to say here, I was struggling with the idea of taking this day to myself, in part because she's back to work now. She's a school teacher. So it's exhausting work and it's stressful, especially at the beginning of the school year. And I thought I needed the break. I just needed to get out of the house and just clear my head. And in doing this, I felt really revitalized. I felt refreshed. And I did a 6-mile hike, so not bad at all around Nashville. I also sweated my body weight twice along the way. In that evening, she asked me, how was your day? And I said, great. And I wasn't going to tell her about it because I felt kind of guilty, but she pressed me a little, and I'm also very honest. And I confessed to taking my artist day, my mental health break. And she loved it. She loved the idea. She said it was, great that I did it. And she's incredibly supportive. And I'm really lucky to have her in my life, I have to say. So I share this all with you today because I want to inspire you to maybe take your own artist date. If you want to learn more about it, Julia Cameron has that book, The Artist's Way, which is a great book. You can also read about this. Some of this is what I've shared in my weekly email newsletter, which you can find at wisesquirrels.com. I call the newsletter The Nice Maker, and you can find a link to that at the footer of the bottom of the page at wisesquirrels.com. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Todd Love, and you can find him at drtoddlove.com. Todd and I had a deep conversation about several different aspects of ADHD. We spoke about the history of ADHD as an acronym, the different names it's had over the years, because that can often get confusing for people. But we really spoke a lot about addiction, everything from internet addiction, porn, alcohol, drugs. Addiction can be pretty rampant in ADHDers. And without spending time here explaining it to you, I'd rather just share this interview with you. It's an important topic and one that I hope you find really helpful. We got started by talking about his careers, how he's pivoted from different career to finally land in the work that he was meant to do, help late diagnosed adults with ADHD. So let's do it.
So ADHD has always kind of driven my life. And I'm fortunate to have been diagnosed the opposite of late life. I was diagnosed at 4, been on meds since I was 6. And so I've still had my lifelong struggles. They tried to kick me out of every school I went to and called me behavior problems and all that stuff. So ADHD hasn't really, been well known as a thing, but I did have that as part of my thing. And so that allowed things like accommodation. Point being, I think you and I are about the same age. So in the late 70s, early 80s, when I was in, elementary and middle and all that stuff, one thing that comes with ADHD is like dysgraphia. I could never learn to write cursive. So they got permission. I was on a keyboard. So I started using the old Apple IIe's and all that kind of stuff, which when I got to college using it, or I worked in the computer lab and all this stuff. So when I got out of undergrad, I worked for an IBM subsidiary, Lotus. You may remember Lotus,
yeah,
3, Lotus Notes and all that stuff. And so because I was a bit of a computer person at the time, and so they had a tuition reimbursement program, 100% for graduate school if I went into business school, which I had no real interest in. But my dad's like, a free degree is a good degree. So having the ADD energy, I worked full time. I went to business school at night, and it was really good and engaging. I enjoyed that. And when we are people with ADHD put into something that we're driven towards, we just shine and all that stuff.
Yes.
So time passes and all this stuff. I start fading out in the interest. It wasn't new anymore and all that stuff. So that career. So I'm back to night school again, this time for law. So I was working a full-time corporate job. I was studying law at night. And that wasn't kind of the same experience. There was a breaking point for me. And, and so addiction issues came and all this stuff. Eventually, I finished law school, passed the bar, and then got in the car and drove straight basically to rehab and did all that stuff. Stuff that I'm open about in general, but I won't elaborate in the moment. But so I made a career change, and I was a DUI defense, left the corporate world. I was a DUI defense attorney. And I realized pretty quickly into it that I felt better about myself if I was to, not take someone's check and help them work through their second, DUI or whatever it is. Not that I have any judgment on that, but instead, if we sat down for 2 hours and I got them to go and make major life changes. And so one of my colleagues was talking to me at a thing, and he was being kind of quippy. You should be their therapist and not their lawyer. And the bell just went off for me. Like, that's it. That's what I want to do. So, night school again. And I did the counseling thing. So, that's just that transition story between, how do you go from an attorney or even corporate guy to attorney to this field. So I'm currently licensed as a mental health clinician, a therapist. I cross-trained as an ADHD coach because there's good techniques to meld with there. I keep the attorney's license, but I don't do anything with it. And so, my primary practice is a men's or people who identify as male counseling and coaching practice. And so,
yeah, that's amazing. Yeah. That's amazing. And it's funny how somebody suggests something and suddenly like the light bulb goes off. I have had that experience multiple times through my career as well. And even leading the Wise Squirrels to this very podcast that's something there too. You've got a framework that you've developed, right? Tell me about, tell me about that.
Before I do that, there's something I like to do. Mm-hmm. Kind of setting the stage for myself, making myself feel more comfortable.
Yeah.
You may remember the old Hair Club for Men commercial in the 80s where the guy said, I'm not only the president, I'm also a member.
Yes.
So I guess I had already acknowledged, my ADHD indirectly earlier in the conversation. But I like to just really put it up front and say, this is not me owning it. I'm very ADHD. And that manifests largely, or in lots of areas, but it manifests in situations like this with excitability. I'll jump around, I'll trail off, I'll lose my point and all that stuff. So I do keep my notes to keep me focused. Feel free to redirect me. But I used to hate public speaking because I would get reviews. He jumped around too much. He was fidgety and, at the podium. And it was just, rejection sensitivity was horrible. And so when colleagues said, you should just own it. You should just tell people, hey, I'm ADD. I'm going to talk fast. I'm going to jump around. I'm going to lose my place. And then I guess people could still make negative comments, but it kind of makes them a jerk at that point. And so it made it so much more. And that is part of the framework is just becoming comfortable with and owning your ADHD. Then you just don't have to carry that weight about it.
Yeah, that's a good tip. So, that's a great tip. Yeah.
So, going back to what you had mentioned, I put together I was doing a continuing ed class for adult ADHD this summer, and it gave me an opportunity to go through and just collect, go through all the expert material. There's so much great stuff out there, thousands of papers. Not that I've read thousands of papers, but, as Russell Barkley puts it, this is really well studied, despite the fact that people don't seem to know anything about it. And so as I tried to present it to clinicians, so people can get, up to date. And I also realize this is what I've been using with my clients, but it's, kind of a 3-part thing. And it is, owning or understanding your ADHD, what it is, what's going on in my brain, owning it and accepting it as part of owning it, and then learning to manage it. And that's the model that I realized it just makes sense. And so that's kind of what I can talk through today, if you think that will be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So you said owning and accepting and managing it. Is that right?
Understanding it being the first one.
Yeah.
And then owning it, or owning/accepting.
Yeah.
And then learning to manage it.
Yeah. So let's go through that. Like, what are some tips and ideas and strategies for folks listening who are also late diagnosed adults, to understand understand ADHD?
Sure. Yeah. And there's so much, as we know, misinformation or lack of information. And, even just in the name, attention deficit, as Hallowell and it says, we don't have a deficit of attention. Or this might be a Dodson thing, its ability to regulate it and manage it on demand. So, really understanding that, what it is. There is a huge amount of research, about there's the genetic component, there's the wiring component, there's the dopamine component, there's just all this stuff. We are non-neurotypicals, living in a neurotypical world, but we can take so much messaging that we are, character defects, that we're doing it wrong, we're not going to get it, we're stupid, all that shame stuff that but in reality, we're just kind of wired different. So, and we won't take the time, I think, today to go into the details, and I have to pull up notes to remember, what all the details, but everything from neural networks to, again, genetics to blood flow and functioning and dopamine levels and all that, it's just a brain-based thing. And for people to really get that. I've had some clients that's taken them, that are late diagnosed, a guy, or whatever, 20s or 30s, and just refused to believe that this was really a thing. People have just talked bad about it. It's just a, pharma hype or whatever it is. I just am really not very smart. I can't get my pieces together. And so really understanding, wait, no, let's pull up all the research. Let's put it out there. Look at these slides, a brain scan and all this stuff.
Yeah.
So that can make such a difference to, and for clinicians, people who are trying to work with people with ADHD or partners or whoever, to understand this is a brain-based thing. There's just tons of stuff out there that you could, it's a neurobiologically based disorder. So that's kind of a first part, is for people to really understand that, yeah. And then once we get it, then we can own it and say, okay, I am wired differently. It's, I am a non-neurotypical in a neurotypical world. And so, and that requires understanding, that first part, self-compassion. So, and then ego strength, really, to be able to say, I'm okay, this is a thing, to put boundaries with others. Wait, I'm a person with ADHD. I can't, always take neurotypical standards because I'm not going to meet them. And so who is it that wanted the attention different, not deficit? I try to remember who I'm citing because I try to reference all the expert people. That might be a Hallowell or Dodson thing. Yeah. But yeah, so that part of owning it was how Hallowell said, find and embrace your weird.
Yeah.
Or I like that. And Dodson, is write your own owner's manual. We just can't measure ourselves to the outside world standards. Even like productivity systems, people talk about finding productivity system. When I'm doing that coaching work with my clients, like, we have to take this with a grain of salt, because it's not, the get things done or the this or all these great systems. They're not going to fully meet our brains because we are just kind of different. Yeah. And so these things that are effective for everyone else aren't necessarily effective for us.
When you go back sorry to interrupt, but when you mentioned understanding it, what are your thoughts around, I understand that ADD is just now ADHD. Like, ADHD is the thing, and yet so many people still refer to ADD and ADHD as two different things. And then I guess it confuses people too, because like ADA, who's really like one of the most well-known groups that folks with ADHD can join, and they have a conference and all that. But of course, the name and even the magazine Attitude is it doesn't have the H. And so any thoughts around that?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good one. It's one of the slides I used that I jumped past. But the naming history. So going super fast, like it was first in 1980. They came out with the name attention deficit disorder, ADD, and it said with or without hyperactivity. And that only lasted for 7 years. Then when the DSM-3 came out, they revised it to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, so ADHD. So really that name was only there in the 80s, but it has really stuck. Yeah. And there have been changes, ADHD, they added subtypes in the mid 90s, and then they replaced subtypes with presentations in the DSM-5. But it has always been, ADHD, and it's not AD/HD or, anything like that. It's just always been ADHD. Yeah. But because that core was out there for a while, and it's just lazy and easier to say. I say lazy because I say, right. I mean, that is a judgment thing. It's just easy to say ADD. Yeah. But yeah, as an official name from 1980 to 1987 is when it was actually a thing.
Was it something before that?
Yeah. So in the first DSM, it was minimal brain dysfunction, which is ugly sounding. Yeah. And then in 1968, in the DSM-2, it was hyperkinetic reaction of childhood. Whew. So that's what they nailed me with, because I was a really hyper kid. Yeah. And so they knew nothing of the cognitive side or self-regulation or whatever. But the history is really interesting. People talk about fidgety. Have you heard of fidgety Phil?
No, I haven't.
Oh my gosh. So it was a story written in 1844 by Heinrich Hoffmann. He was the founder of the first mental hospital in Frankfurt, and it's a little animated thing, or it talks about story of fidgety Phil describes a child with what we would call today ADHD, and so but fidgety Phil, he won't sit still, he wriggles and giggles, and there's this whole thing, and there's these pictures of him fidgeting at the table, and then he falls back and he pulls the tablecloth, and all the dishes fly everywhere, and all this. But I don't know if he was talking about his son or a client. But as people look back, they thought it just went to Fidgety Phil. That's kind of a more well-known one. But when I was doing my research for the thing, or my presentation, the furthest back I found that they talk about was, what was that, 1775? They talked about a syndrome that described all the ADHD stuff in a German medical textbook. And in 1798, in a Scottish textbook, another guy, he talked about, again, a syndrome-based thing. And then the mid-1800s with Fidgety Phil, but we didn't pick up on it until the 1950s when the DSM came out.
That's interesting. It's really cool. Yeah, that is cool. I mean, I know with like executive functioning skills and things like that, where, even like cavemen, I guess, were, building fires and trying to figure stuff out. And so needing these executive functioning skills were obviously a core part of that as well. So yeah, it's pretty fascinating how far back. I mean, it goes as long as we've been around, but how it's received different names, different labels over time. So, all right. So present day, we're at ADHD, and, our listener here has been diagnosed with ADHD. So now it's a step around owning and accepting it. How do you go about handling that, as far as like communicating with your clients?
Yeah. That's a lot of counseling goes around that, or peer support, the stuff with ADA and all these other places, where people can find other folks like us, like say us instead of them, because it's, same club. But that component is really just so important. And there's so much good material out there, good books and all that stuff. So, but it can be quite a while. Some people, they've known something was going on, for a long time, and it's such this sigh of relief, when you get that diagnosis, and it's just like it's life changing. Ari Tuckman did a presentation on this at the conference a few years ago, and he talks about how grieving the past for a little while, but then looking towards the future and what are we going to build and how are we going to, manage it. And so, which is that third part. And, when I'm talking about medications, counseling, coaching, and self-care, kind of complementary, not mutually exclusive. And I try to say manage instead of treat. Some of the stuff is treatment, ADHD treatment, medication. Well, they say medication management, but try to not pathologize it. As you know, we're not sick or broken. We're just wired different. And that's just, people that need glasses aren't sick. So
when it comes to, just taking a step back to the owning and accepting part, are there specific strategies or things that you recommend someone does to start the process of this acceptance? Because like for me personally, I've developed a presentation. I do a lot of public speaking called the Root Down, and the Root Down has like 3 steps or 3 kind of phases, I guess you can say, in it. And again, I'm not an expert in ADHD. I mean, I'm still learning about this stuff myself. But what I have found in my own life and the coping mechanisms and things that I've used, it really, for me, it comes down to knowing myself, knowing yourself, and then respecting yourself and that self-acceptance, and then connecting yourself with community, with others, and finding folks who are like-minded. So getting into that acceptance stage that, and I suppose that would be kind of fitting in with respecting yourself. What are some strategies someone can use to accept themselves?
I really like what you had just put around it. So I'm thinking out loud, I don't think I have specific set of strategies that really varies in my practice by client, where they are and how the presentation has been. And, so how much of this is a shock and they really need to understand it and this ownership piece, or is it a sigh of relief and people want to put it on, put on the jacket and whatever the metaphor is and say, okay, this fits me. I get it. I'm with it. But people just really vary, how much collateral damage has there been over the years, and how much do we have to get past that? And the guy that comes in, and I usually get emotional when I try to do the quote, but he had just gotten his first medication, and it was just I can see clearly now kind of a thing. And then he pauses and just silence for like 10 minutes. And so he then says, if somebody had diagnosed me earlier, if I had gotten this medication, then I wouldn't have. And he basically lists out all the Russell Barkley criteria of what happens to people if they don't get diagnosed. Failed out of college twice, gone to jail for 6 months for this, been divorced, all these things. It's like, I wanted to be someone. I was going to go to law school and all this stuff. Instead, 15 years passed and it's been a wreck. And so in that case, there is a lot to process, and that goes into a therapy side as well, but really understanding that. And,
and I know this is an area of specialty that you focus on around addiction and ADHD, and talk a little bit about the connection between, addictive personalities and addiction as it applies to folks with ADHD.
Yeah, that's a great, really important topic. That's one of my specialty areas. The connection between ADHD, physiological, the brain has an inherent neurobiological predisposition. And there's, I found in one of the articles, a big fancy chart of all the brain networks that are impaired in ADHD, stuff that is beyond my area of knowledge or really interest, except for one of them that stuck out, and that's the reward network. And that's what gets hijacked in addiction. But that's where, as a person with ADHD, I'm already impaired from the get-go. New, shiny, novel, impulse control stuff, failing the marshmallow test, all those things. It takes people, the neurotypical brain, frequently some time to get there, where we start there already. So a lot of the genetics that are found in ADHD, some of them are also the same dopamine receptor genes that are found in people with addiction. So there is a huge, just, out of the gate, a biological predisposition for it. Poor judgment, all that stuff. And then the psychological component, we're more likely to experiment, the self-medication piece. And so, that yields towards there's higher rates of, what was it, a statistic, something like 40% of people in addiction treatment programs had ADHD, and like maybe a third had been diagnosed. A lot of them just nobody knew, their lives went off on this path and they wound up,
you kind of use other things like, caffeine or narcotics or alcohol or whatever as like, I guess in a way it's sort of a coping mechanism, but it also kind of helps to provide that sort of dopamine hit, I guess, to help replace what's missing that meds could actually help with.
Right.
You also have a specialty in internet addiction. And I've been, was preparing for the conversation today, I was thinking about how I recently changed my medication and, also to something a little heavier. Apparently I had started a little too light. But anyway, I've been an early proponent of social media, and I've been on all the social networks since the very early days of this stuff. But I found lately, actually, I commented today that I haven't really been on here much lately. And it just occurred to me that maybe the new meds I'm on are helping me curb my own addiction to social media. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's really interesting observation. That's pretty cool. Articles have gone back a while. They have Silicon Valley people have, acknowledged that they brought in, research psychologists or, all these different, when they design the apps, to activate that brain system to, the infinite scroll. Every time you scroll, there's a little hit of dopamine of, what's going to be next. They used to think that addiction center in the brain back in the 80s was the pleasure center, the pleasure principle and all that. And now they talk about more, it's the reward center. It's our response to reward. You give a kid a gold star, he lights up, or a dog a bone, he lights up, and that's how we learn to do something. It's just, that's why it's there evolutionarily. But it gets hijacked. So, every hit of the refresh button or scroll or whatever, there's this, what they found most recently, and they don't talk about it as much because the reward model is more clear cut, but it's that anticipation of reward. So like they see it most in gamblers, like win or lose, the spike is when the dice are flying out of the hand. And that's really where like the infinite scroll, every time what is the refresh? What is the latest thing going to be? What's the latest on the homepage? And so doing that repetitively, people start getting a little dopamine dependent or whatever. That's where that myth comes in that it's, the internet is making people ADHD. And, we know that that can't happen. It can give people ADHD-like symptoms because people get used to always, needing that little hit, that little boost, and other things are less interesting. So sitting there and doing something that's not as rewarding as picking up my phone and checking to see what the latest whatever is.
Yeah.
So people get drawn towards that, but it's not like the ADHD brain where we're already drawn towards that, and then we can have a harder time getting out of it.
Yeah. And it's interesting also with the design. I used to work in consumer electronics, and I've done some work in the SaaS kind of program, industry as well, and the software as a service. And so I've learned a lot about, and also because I'm an early adopter in this stuff, I'm naturally interested in, I've also been a pretty big fan of media studies and Marshall McLuhan and things like that. So I bring that up because Tristan Harris has a group, or he's co-founder of the Center for Humane Tech, and I really like the work they're doing. They did the movie on Netflix that a lot of people might have seen.
Social Dilemma.
Yes, the Social Dilemma. And so I've actually done things with my phone personally, like to your point about the reward system and how just when you pull down your screen of your iPhone to refresh it, it makes that clickety click sound that is a very appealing sound that sound designers engineered into the phone. And even the colors, like having the notification, that little red icon with a number on it. But there are strategies that, folks can use for their phones, like they can turn off the notifications. I have a button on the side of my phone. Well, I mean, everybody does, but I click it 3 times and it switches my phone to black and white. So the display is actually black and white, and that helps to curb that natural addictive kind of qualities that are in the very vibrant colors and design of the apps and the operating systems of phones. So are there other things that you have found that help maybe with this, with smartphone addiction or social media or internet in general? I remember the old stumble upon button. I love that thing. Back when the internet was fun, you could use the stumble upon button, you press it, and it would just give you a random website. And there would be all sorts of interesting, cool stuff, but it's just not as much fun anymore.
Right. Yeah. I saw that you have, on your webpage, the Freedom.
Yes.
App. I'm a big proponent, so I use that. I just find it so helpful. Kind of protect yourself from yourself model. And when I'm dealing with clients that are really stuck in addiction and where impulse control is just impaired, for internet related stuff, whether it's gaming, gambling, pornography is a big one. Just going and finding the latest hit, and it becomes compulsive or addictive, and it can take a lot of steps to really block access to that. I love-hate relationship with Apple. I'm not marketing for them at all, but the iOS devices do a very good job. You could lock the crud out of them. You can do a whitelist only kind of a thing. You can turn off browsers, turn off access to the App Store. And that's a process I'll go through with clients. We'll say, what apps we'll pull out a notepad, and what apps do you have to have? Because they used to say, just get rid of your smartphone, get a flip phone or whatever. But no, I have to have dual factor authentication. I have to get into my bank. I have to do all these things that require a smartphone. But it doesn't have to have any games on it. It doesn't have to have anything with an infinite scroll on it. It doesn't have to have a browser on it.
Yeah.
And then you lock it down. Someone else can take the screen time password. If they're in recovery, give it to accountability partner or whatever kind of a thing. And then it just, this renewed relationship with the device. And it's an interesting process. People can at first really regret it, but then be so grateful later. And just, it's like all I can do is communications or productivity or nothing. That thing of picking up your phone habitually to like escape in it, and there's nothing to do. So you just put it back down and move on.
Yeah.
That's a really powerful benefit people can find.
Yeah. I was using Freedom. And I'll include a link to that, in the app in the show notes. So like when folks are listening, they can find that, and it's on the website too. Cause I'm a big believer and lover of that app. But yeah, when I started using Freedom, I had given up social media for a summer, and also Google News, like all the news. I try to like block myself from that because it was an especially stressful period. And what I found was, but of course I was still carrying my phone because I have a business. I need to take phone calls and to your point, check your bank and all that stuff. So giving up your smartphone, I think, is as sexy as that may sound, or maybe not sexy, depending. It's not always the easiest thing to do. And so following kind of what you just said, and then also using Freedom, I started reading so much more on my Kindle. Cause I would be reading on the like Paperwhite Kindle device, my ebook reader. And then I would go walk the dog. And when I was out with the dog, out of habit, I would take my phone out, but I would only have like the Kindle app to use. And so I would go back and so I started reading way more, I found. Another thing I found with screen time that you mentioned is, when you start checking your screen time, and to Apple's credit, you're right, like having screen time is huge because you start to see, whoa, like I spent 5 hours today on Twitter or whatever it's called, or, whatever the social network is. So it is pretty sobering to see just how much time in a day we're spending on, different social platforms or apps and things like that. So, yeah. Do you have some like specifics where like someone has come to you with some form of internet addiction and how you helped with that?
Yeah, that's a large part of my practice. Let's see here. Getting addicted to, or I guess, games, which it can be internet or console, but I guess so many these days people are doing PC games. Gambling, sports betting, and all that kind of stuff gets a bit, but it's not the day-to-day addictive things like that, or social media or porn. Porn is just a big one. There's unnecessary controversy around it. We're not trying to step into human sexuality or people exploring or relationship issues or whatever. In that domain, maybe it's not addictive. But for some people, and a lot of ADHD people, it's just the instant access to raw dopamine. Just whatever's the latest thing on there is interesting and new, and it just floods. And people can have a really hard time getting away from that.
Yeah.
And one of the markers of addiction is swearing, I'm not going to do this anymore. And then they wind back up at the craps table, or I'm not going to do this anymore. And they wind back up pulling whatever, site is. And so, and that's where some heavy initial steps of, like you would never tell an alcoholic, expect him to get sober while carrying the bottle in his pocket. It's just stupid, right? No, we wouldn't do that. But if we're trying to get away from addiction to digital devices and whatever the particular content is, but we're carrying the phone in our pocket. It's really asking, and again, as ADHD people, we're already impulse control impaired. And now we've double impaired that brain region for, dopamine dependency and reactivity and all that kind of stuff. So, it can be really difficult.
Yeah. So, yeah. No. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
No. Yeah. That piece. I guess the next piece is peer accountability is so helpful. Just there's AA found out, 100 plus years ago, just having people like you, as they would say, people like me or whatever that, we could talk to and get understood and not get judged and feel shame and all that stuff. So, putting together support groups of whatever it is, if it's addiction related. And that's something I can talk about in a kind of larger addiction context in a minute if you want me to.
Yeah.
But the impact of ADHD and addiction and trying to find recovery.
Yeah, before we get into that, I do have a quick question, which is, everybody hears, it's best to shut off your screens to get better sleep, like an hour before you go to bed, turn off your screens. And I think that advice sounds wonderful in theory, but I also find, and also like first thing in the morning, don't look at your phone, like enjoy, journal or whatever. But here's the kicker. I have the phone next to me in bed and I know like I have it charged there. And some people say, well, like move the phone out of the room at night or plug it in across your room. And my paranoia is that God forbid there's a fire or somebody breaks into my house. I want to be close to where I can call 911. If my like alarm system doesn't go off for some reason. And the other side of it is like, as my kids are getting older now, sometimes I'm asleep and they're still out. And I want to make sure that I'm there in case one of them calls me, their car is broken down or something like that. So these are the excuses, at least I use, for why I need the phone next to me at night. But at the flip side, I totally respect and appreciate the advice. So how the hell can I get over this?
Yeah, that is a good one. That's a tough one. So like the system my wife and I use is, I don't keep my phone in the bedroom. We just have hers. So we have one there for all that stuff, but it lives on my side of the table, on my bedstand. So there's nothing that she can reach for, that's useful for her. There's nothing that I can reach for because it's her phone and doesn't have any of my stuff on it. So we still, meet that. We have the emergency thing in the bedroom or the communication device in the bedroom, but it's not instantly accessible by either person. You just can't just roll over and grab it. So that's been an interesting thing.
That's genius. I love that. I think that's a great idea. Sorry, go on.
No. But it's also, like I use a meditation app or something, Insight Timer or Headspace or whatever before bed. So the black and white, just like, not having a smartphone, they used to say 10 years ago that you just can't do, not using a device for X amount of time. I guess it depends on what we're doing with it. If I'm sitting there and I'm doing it however long guided meditation on the Headspace app on my phone right before bed, that's not, we don't want to say, well, categorically, that's bad because you're on a device. So it's, I like in the bedtime feature that Apple has put on there, you can select, it changes your home screen. If you've seen how it does that in the wind down. Mm-hmm. So only devices, only the apps that you select to see. I mean, everything's available, but it's not there. So you pick up your phone and I've got a little, sound machine app, my meditation app, one or two other things. So it encourages me to do the stuff that I want to be doing as I'm shutting down and doesn't prime me with, access to other things.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, and you were mentioning earlier that you've got like more ideas around like addiction in general. Is that right?
Sure. Yeah. Let me pull up something. You had talked about, where do I want to go? So, in some of my presentations, I do like a myths and truths about ADHD and addiction. And so, one of the most common myths people talk about is, stimulant medication treatment in childhood will lead to addiction later in life. And I think Russell Ramsey had mentioned in his recent interview with you that new studies have shown that not to be true. Mm-hmm. And the new studies support what they've had for a while. They've really been building on these. So it's just so great that they keep coming up. Looking at a Barclay thing where he's saying, this study concurs with 11 previous studies and all this, that there is no evidence, no compelling evidence that, stimulant medication treatment in childhood leads to risk for, developing addiction in adulthood. And in fact, it reduces the risk. It's what clinicians would call a protective effect. And it makes sense when you think about it. If I'm not struggling as a kid, if I'm not taking all the esteem hits, if I'm not needing to self-medicate and all this stuff, my life is well managed, then the chances of my falling into impulse control issues, the chances of my falling into Medicaid and all that stuff is just less. Mm-hmm. So it's logical when you think about it. That's that first piece.
Yeah.
So then the second one, people talk about long-term stimulant use can lead to addiction. And that's not true. There's no, and I'm not an MD, so I'm not going to step out of my lane. But based on all their studies that I've read and all the stuff from MetSART and all that stuff, and I was diagnosed at 4 and started meds when I was 6, and I'm now early 50s, and I've been on stimulant med ever. We don't get addicted to them, and tolerance is rare, independence, and all that stuff. Some people, it can happen. There's outliers for everything, but just this fear that if I take it for too long, I'm become addicted. And then I'll talk about that in another piece about that in a second. But that third piece in my addiction and ADHD is people with ADHD rarely abuse it. And so it's interesting. There was a study in, I think it was Sweden or something, that people that were addicted to stimulants, like crystal meth, and they identified the ADHD people in this study, and they got them on methylphenidate treatment, and that did not agitate their stimulant addiction in terms of going back to meth. It helped actually reduce their likelihood. So I thought that was an interesting thing. But so then there's myths about addiction treatment. And one is people with ADHD must discontinue their meds, in order to get sober. And you see that a lot in treatment centers. They're just, and I guess it's kind of a simplistic, because stimulant meds are a drug of abuse, a controlled substance. Therefore, anybody in recovery, we don't want them to transition to another thing. But they don't take to account that the ADHD brain is not a neurotypical brain. So while these meds, people that are at a normal baseline, they take stimulant meds, they get some euphoric, they get jacked up, they get all this stuff. It doesn't do that for us. For me, it puts me at a baseline. If I try to abuse it and take too much, I just get super anxious. It's not fun for us. And who was it? Barkley or someone, I forget who it was, that said, we can struggle to remember until we get the routine to remember to take our meds. And he said, forgetting to take your drugs is not drug-seeking behavior, which I thought was a great way of putting it.
Yeah.
Addicts don't forget, where we can forget.
Yeah.
And so, so they found that people in recovery that take their meds, they're more likely to be compliant with whatever their recovery plan is, to get their life back on the track such that they are less likely to fall back into the behaviors. So just like taking meds growing up is a a protective effect. Taking meds, continuing to take meds while in addiction recovery is a pro-recovery choice. It keeps us in the better, space. It fills that gap so we're less likely to fall into relapse and all that kind of stuff. So those are two really important points.
Yeah, no, they're very good. Very, very helpful. Yeah, definitely. And as far as like you touched on it a little bit, but about, internet or sex addiction or porn addiction, things like that. Are there ways to kind of curb that or ways to treat that?
Yeah, that's a big topic. And, it can be, controversy around the concept of, sex addiction. Is it a thing or is it a not? And so I won't get into that. I'm a certified sex addiction therapist. That's a strong area of my practice. So I do believe that, behaviors can get compulsive and addictive and all that kind of stuff. The internet pornography addiction, I think, is more easily, I don't know why I'm speaking to the controversy, but I guess because this goes on the open internet for anyone to hear, I'll speak to it in super quick, is more, easy to identify. Right. So we can say if someone is compulsively using their phone to gamble, they have a gambling addiction. If they're compulsively gaming, they have a gaming addiction. If they're compulsively using it to look at porn, that can't be an addiction because that involves human sexuality, which is sacred and is never addictive. And that's just kind of crazy. So this stuff can become compulsive in driving and, take over people's lives. So as with any addiction, there is generally, I'll correct myself in a second, but an underlying driver. That's how some people will say, it's not really this. It's because they have a whatever thing. There's a lot of trauma underneath addiction or people needing to work out all kinds of stuff, unmedicated, this and that. But I'm finding that addiction or ADHD can be its own driver for addiction. And I guess that supports like not treating in childhood, can lead to stuff. Especially these days, just growing up, I can't imagine having grown up with instant access to the internet. And it just kind of blows my mind. And the pornography and all the content to just pull up anything and see it, as a horny adolescent, it would just, I'm allowed to say that,
Mhm.
it'd be overpowering. So finding the average age of exposure to pornography is like way lower than people think. It's like 10.
Yeah.
And, the compulsive use is higher than is reported. And then if you have an ADHD kid who is, again, already more driven for novelty, more driven, to reward, and less strong in impulse control. I guess I could just say more impulse control impaired. It really sets things up, to be a problem.
Mm.
I don't know if I answered your question. I might have gone somewhere else.
No. I mean, we were talking a little bit about the pornography addiction you did a good job kind of explaining that. And really, I think my question was like ways to curb that.
Mm. Yeah. So, and, as a model, just with addiction in general, finding out what purpose does the behavior serve. So, in pornography addiction, is there a sexual component that needs to be, explored in someone's life and their relationship and whatever, in that domain? But is there an escape? Where is the escape piece? Just the raw addiction. A lot of times people will switch, or they get fused, like cannabis and gaming, or cannabis and porn, or whatever. They do both at the same time, and it potentiates a high. And so to say, well, let's stop doing this, then the other one, it's like the whack-a-mole game, if you remember that.
Mm-hmm.
People stop doing both, and suddenly they've, started drinking a lot. And drinking was never a problem for me, but now that I'm, got rid of my Xbox and stopped smoking pot, I'm like going out and drinking with the guys 5 times more than I used to.
Mm.
So that's can be, an area to monitor, is to make sure it just doesn't come out in another mole pops out of the thing.
So what you're saying is really just a great way to manage it is really just to really track, I guess, or record like what you're doing, not record, but track what you're doing. So to keep track of that. And also, I find journaling to be really helpful and beneficial too, because like you can look back and see your notes about what is working or what isn't working, and kind of help to celebrate your wins and also learn from the failures that everybody faces, in life.
I think that's great. Yeah. And journaling is, because we can forget, and as people with ADHD, we're more likely to forget. But certainly people with addiction forget the positives, and we remember the negatives, and that drives us into anxiety to want to do stuff again. But journaling the stuff, our reasons why I'm doing something. Why do I want this life change? What is it that I like about myself? And that in this time period when I wasn't using, I felt better. Being able to refresh that, to memorialize it, and then refresh it, ourselves with it, is journaling is a great tool.
Yeah, no, this is very helpful. I was thinking about the porn thing, and how in Tennessee, where I live in Nashville, Tennessee, it has been proposed to age gate porn sites, which if you've been on the internet for any amount of time, you would quickly learn is one of the stupidest ideas, just because it will never work. But of course, not all our leaders are the brightest. I am in Tennessee. One only has to take a look. But I digress. So any thoughts to that, or?
Yeah, I've been following some of that as well. Years ago, I think it was like the late 90s, early 2000s, when the internet was really becoming more publicly accessible, there was a proposal or whatever to create a domain, a .xxx, and mandatory any pornographic content or whatever would go into there. And then someone could just, with a single line item, just block access to all of it, should they choose. And that was shot down, all pulled apart with, First Amendment, freedom of speech, or whatever arguments that they use, even though it would be a voluntary thing. I think it's a shame that something like that didn't go through.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of dark money funding that comes out of the porn industry.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm probably not supposed to say things like this on the net, but it's just true. And they fund the studies that say, oh, no, this is not addictive, you're just a prude, or, oh, no, this isn't a problem, you just need to, whatever. But they influence legislation and all these things as well. That is just, if people want to have containers around this, it's been really hard to find ways to do it.
Yeah, and to put it in a box now and lock it up, I'm not really sure how that would even work. It's almost like the release of AI. I mean, it's out now, so good luck. But yeah, no, I kind of feel the same way. I mean, to the porn industry's credit, not that I have any skin in the game, pardon the pun, but But to the porn industry's credit, they've also, from a technology standpoint, have actually been responsible for a lot of really great innovation. Like, they were the first to do streaming video. They were the first to, they were the ones that made VHS kill beta because of the ease of recording and copying VHS tapes. So there's a lot of interesting tech sort of aspects of the porn industry, but certainly, I'm not defending the industry at all.
And the blockers, I've used blockers and all this stuff, and the critics are correct in things like, sexual health sites get blocked if you try to have an adult content blocker because the algorithms aren't smart enough to know. So if somebody is going to explore sexuality or sexual health sites or whatever, and so there is no solution.
Yeah.
And I want to add one last thing, in all this, just since it's going on the net and, my name on, I'm not any more anti-porn than I am anti-cannabis or alcohol or whatever. Plenty of people use it and find it interesting or whatever, and I don't care at all. The people that I care about are the ones that it takes over their life. They can't stop going back to it, whether it's alcohol or cannabis or, or whatever it is. Even though there's not a physical dependence on cannabis, there's still a huge addiction component. But games, I'm a gamer. I've got my Xbox. I've been playing Halo ever since it came out. But I know that it can take me down if I don't have my regulations around it and rules and restrictions and all that. And that's the position I come from with pornography. Not anti-it, but acknowledge that it is a risk for some people, just like alcohol is a risk for some people to get addicted to. And for ADHD people, we carry a higher risk.
Yeah, perfectly said. And my son is an Xbox gamer as well. And my only complaint with the state of gaming is when I was a kid, I could come over to my friend's house or vice versa, and we could just fire up the computer or whatever the gaming device was and play a game together. And now, for a kid to go to another friend's sleepover, if they want a game together, they actually have to bring the whole Xbox with them and have another monitor or TV to plug into for them to sit in the same room and game together, which I find kind of sad and genius also of the game of the companies. Yeah.
Can I talk to gaming addiction real quick?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Do we have time for that?
Yeah.
So I know we're coming up on time.
Yeah.
But this is something I presented about as well and all that stuff. And people used to, try to measure the amount of time that somebody is playing in order to be, is it taking over their life or whatever. But you can't really do that these days because there's a huge pro-social component. Somebody will come in and, my kid or my, whatever is spending all this time. But do they have their headset on and they're laughing and joking with their old college friends? Then that's different than are they doing it, are they doing it, what are they getting out of it? There's a huge intellectual, I call it an intellectual component. I've always been a first person campaign guy. I like to figure things out, experience the story. There's a lot of art and creativity and all that.
Yeah.
It's the newer stuff. It's the short burst, high intensity that is the same thing as the slot machine, same thing as, as an instant. An infinite scroll where you log in, and that's where some of the bigger games are. League of Legends and all this kinds of stuff. Just to randomly pick one. There's tons of them. I don't know why that came to mind. But a little 5 to 10 minute thing. It's just this short burst, high intensity. That's what just floods the brain. That's what people. One more round, and they start putting things off that they're going to be doing, and that really bites them in the brain. And that's the stuff where so people are going to be doing less of that, but they got to get some every day, and they're pushing stuff out, and that's where gaming starts getting to be problematic and from a neurologic perspective, addictive.
Yeah, and to your point, and I agree with the aspect of gaming being a way for kids and adults to socialize. I think that is a really important point. And also, if you look at the comparison of the gaming industry revenue compared to the box office or even digital streaming film movie box or revenue, the gaming industry is far more profitable. And I say that because kids are bonding like I would bond over movies with friends or music. They're bonding over video games now. And that's good. I mean, it's great. Like they're playing together, and this is the thing. So, this was the deciding factor or part of it in letting our kids have smartphones eventually once they hit, I think it was 13 or 14, because their friends had them. And this is the way they communicated with one another. And so for you to tell your kids, no, sorry, you can't have a phone because of concerns about this stuff. Unfortunately, I think the most important thing is to talk to your kids and open the dialogue, talk about addiction, talk about porn, have them understand the dangers and give them what they need. And I'm not perfect in any way in raising my kids, but I have done my best to school them on this stuff over the years so that they understand what they're looking at and the dangers that are there. And, my daughter's just like every other teen girl, on TikTok constantly and Snap and such. But to her credit, she had some friends over recently, and my wife and I both noted we overheard her say, okay, everybody put your phones away, blah, 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 like whatever we're going to do. And she was the one that instigated everybody putting the phones away. So while she's on it a lot, like most kids and adults for that matter, it was really refreshing, and it was just okay. I think we're okay. Just to hear that. So I was really proud of her.
Love that.
Yeah. I think yeah. So
and to tie all that back, really, like, that's neat. I'm smiling, which I guess you can't see on a podcast. Yeah. For adults, none of those things are bad if we can regulate them. And tying it back into people with ADHD, that's where we're going all this. As I guess both Russell Ramsey, and I love his work. I can't believe I just listened to his podcast. It's just great that you had it. But anyway, and Barkley both say, ADHD is a self-regulatory disorder. Yeah. And so as we're looking at things, addiction wise, can I regulate my use of games? Or is this particular game that I downloaded one that I don't feel like I can regulate it? It is just too intense, too, drawing. And so I'm going to have to forfeit whatever I paid for it and just move on to the next game, because listen to that intuition, because we just struggle to regulate. And these things are designed to be such that, the more we come back as a consumer, the more money they make, right?
Yeah.
And so, we're fighting an uphill battle and trying to regulate stuff. And so people just being mindful of that. Can I regulate it? Do I feel comfortable with this? Should I just dump it and move on? Because I'm going to get bit.
Yeah, and the old line with, you pay for a game, so that might be a little different, but the old line with like social networks, for example, if you are not paying for it, you are the product. So
I love that social dilemma thing. That is so great. That is such a profound point you just pulled out.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about today that we didn't discuss as we wind it down?
No, I think we got a lot of, that understanding our ADHD, learning to own it, be comfortable with it, accept it, and then managing it. And all the different ways, meds, counseling may be needed to really deal with the impact of where I could have gone, where I went instead. And just, there's a whole mess that, we have to work with. And then coaching techniques and learning to get to where I want to go. What are my pieces and systems and routines and all that stuff? And then we can be just fine.
Yeah, no, this has been great. How can people get a hold of you? How can they learn more about your work and what you do and say hello?
My domain is Doc Todd Love, so DocToddLove. And they're free to email me, Todd at doctoddlove.com, or check out, I'm not a researcher or a publisher, any of that kind of stuff. I'm primarily focused as a clinician, but I do put my presentations and and stuff like that on my website so people can download it and try to get, the stuff that I'm talking off one of my presentations right now, so they can get access to a lot of these points that I talked really quickly past.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. And I encourage everybody to check your content out because it's great stuff. Thank you so much. This has been fun.
Thank you for having me. This has been fantastic.
Hey, if you liked what you heard today, would you do me a favor? Would you visit wisesquirrels.com/love? That's where you'll find links to become a Patreon by supporting the show. You can advertise on the show. You can also record an audio comment question, or even email me a question that I can include in an upcoming episode. And you can even leave a little review to let me know how I'm doing. There's more there. wisesquirrels.com/love.